Shabbos Daf Mem Gimel finds us in the middle of a discussion about potential reasons why you would be forbidden from using a perfectly non-muktzah kli under certain rules of muktzah. We will have a machlokes between Rav Chizda and Rav Yitzchak as to which rules apply. Then we'll have a machlokes between two Amoraim as to what Rav Chizda really holds. Then we'll get into a whole nother case about a beehive, which may be a proof to Rav Yitzchak, or it may not. The Gemara will discuss that at length and see what that case really is. We'll have a couple of other proofs against Rav Yitzchak, and then we'll get into a discussion about how you can deal with a person who died on Shabbos in order to protect him from the sun, which could cause early decay. So, we're in the middle of a discussion when we begin the daf here about two possible concepts which could make a non-muktzah object have certain halachos of muktzah. And that is the two rules which are not agreed upon, but one rule is called bitul kli meheichano, and the other rule is called ein kli nitel el tzarech davar hanitel. Now, again, muktzah, as we discussed in the past, means that a kli has no function, an object which is functionless. If it is functionless, it is muktzah. Here you have a perfectly functional kli, like a bowl or a cup. However, it might be forbidden to use it for certain things or to move it for certain reasons. One might be if what you're doing will end up robbing the kli of its functions. So, for example, if you take a bowl and you put it in a place where it'll catch something muktzah, now the kli will be muktzah, and it'll be impossible to do anything with the rest of Shabbos. That would be usher, because it's like you're destroying the kli, or it's like you are nailing it to the ground because it can't be moved afterwards. That's called bitul kli meichano, destroying the function. The other possibility might be that it's only permitted to move any object in the world for the sake of non-muktzah things. If you intend to pick up a perfectly non-muktzah cup, but you intend to use it to protect or serve something muktzah, like you want to cover an egg, which is muktzah, then that would be forbidden for you to even pick up the cup in the first place, because you're just trying to use it to serve muktzah things. These two concepts are not clear, not agreed by any stretch of the imagination. They will form the basis of the first part of the daf. And what's happening here is we're in the middle of a discussion about eggs. And we had seen that Rav Chizda had said that an egg, which is laid on Shabbos, so the egg is muktzah, that's clear. The egg did not exist at the moment that Shabbos began, and therefore, obviously, it was functionless at the moment that Shabbos began. Functionless because it's non-existent. It's called nolad. And Rav Chizda had said, therefore, you can't put a kli to catch that egg when it falls, but you are allowed to put a kli on top of the egg after it's laid to cover it over. And the Gemara is trying to understand Rav Chizda's opinion. Later we will see that Rav Yitzchak disagrees, and Rav Yitzchak says you're not allowed to do either of those two things. But let's discuss Rav Chizda first. So he said that to catch the egg is forbidden, but to cover the egg is permitted. Why would that be? So the first opinion we had seen was Rava. Rava had said that really, Rav Chizda holds that you're not allowed to use any object you're not allowed to use any non-muktzah object for any muktzah purpose, so you cannot use it for the egg for anything. However, the reason why you're allowed to use it to cover the egg is because that's a common thing. It's a common situation of monetary loss, and the Rabbanan allowed you to violate this halacha for common monetary losses. However, needing to catch the egg because it was about to roll down the slope and smash, that's uncommon, that we didn't allow you to do this for uncommon things. So we're in the middle of a list of challenges of situations where you have an uncommon loss, and the Rabbanan allowed you to use a kli to help something muktzah. Any of these problems, any of these things would disprove Rava, and Rava is going to answer all of them by saying that it's something new, and therefore it really is common to have loss. So we're up to the third question here, and the question is about the case of putting a bowl over a candle that's burning. The problem would be that the candle might catch the roof on fire, and you're allowed to. Now, obviously, the roof is muktzah. The beam of the roof doesn't have a function. You can't do anything with it. It's built into your house. But you're allowed to put a bowl on top of the fire in order to protect the beam. So if Rabba's right that you aren't allowed to move any kli for the sake of a muktzah object. Why are you allowed to do this? And don't tell me this is a common damage, because it's uncommon for the fire to reach the roof and light it on flame. So Rabbah answers, no, we're talking about low ceilings, and therefore it's common. Okay, the next case is where you have a beam that breaks off the ceiling. And we saw a halacha, we saw in a Mishnah, you're allowed to support the broken beam with a chair or a bench or the side of a bed. Now, a beam breaking is not a common thing. Why would you be allowed to move this non-muktzah object to support this muktzah beam? So Rabbah again says we're talking about where it's a new beam, and the new beams often break when you put the roof on it because we don't know how strong it is. Okay, and the next and final question on Rabbah is that we saw that you're allowed to put a cup to catch dripping water, leaking water on Shabbos. Now, water that leaks from a roof or something like that is useless because you can't drink it. It's usually filthy. So why would you be allowed to put a cleater to catch the water? That's, again, moving a non-muktzah object for a muktzah purpose, which Rabbah said is only permitted if it's common, and leaks are not common. So Rabbah answered, we're talking about a new roof. New roofs leak until you have all the roofs cleared up, until you have all the holes fixed up. Okay, now, this was Rabbah's understanding of Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda said that the reason Rav Chisda had said that you're allowed to use a bowl to cover an egg which was laid on Shabbos, but not to catch an egg which was laid on Shabbos. Now the Gemara brings Rav Yosef's opinion. Rav Yosef says, no, that's not the correct understanding of Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda holds that there is no problem of moving a muktzah object for the sake of a non-muktzah object. You're allowed to put the bowl on top of the kli. You're allowed to put the bowl on top of the egg. You're allowed to use a non-muktzah object to serve a muktzah object. It's not a problem. The only problem is you're not allowed to destroy the function of a non-muktzah object. You're not allowed to make it muktzah. If you were to put it under the chicken to catch the egg, you wouldn't be allowed to move the bowl anymore. It would become functionless. And that you're not allowed to do. So the Gemara says that Abaye asked Rav Yosef, all the 5 questions which we had before also apply on Rav Yosef. All of them are going to be cases where you're catching a muktzah object in a non-muktzah thing and you're destroying its function. And his answer to most of them will be that the kli that you're using, that you're moving, will not itself become muktzah and it won't be an issue. So first of all, the first proof is from the case of catching tevel, catching produce which did not have meiser taken from it, which is in a barrel that breaks. So you're allowed to catch the tevel in another new unbroken kli. So why are you allowed to do that? The new unbroken kli gets muktzah tevel in it, and it would then be functionless. So Rav Yosef answers, no, it's not a problem, because tevel is really not muktzah, because the only problem with tevel is that you can't take meiser off it and use it on Shabbos. However, if somebody would actually go ahead, violate the law, and take meiser off, you would be allowed to use it. So therefore, tevel is not really functionless, it could become full. Okay, so therefore, there is a way of getting the tevel out of the bottom kli, and therefore the bottom kli is not losing its function, it's not becoming muktzah. Okay, next case, we said you're allowed to put a kli under a lamp in order to catch falling sparks. But the sparks are muktzah, it's part of the fire, and that would make the kli that you put underneath it a muktzah. So the Gemara says, no, it's not a problem, sparks have no substance, it's just drops, and there's nothing actually in the kli afterwards, and therefore it wouldn't make it muktzah. The kli doesn't become a muktzah, it's not a problem. Okay, next thing was if you have a beam that breaks, so we said you're allowed to put a chair or a bench or a beam to support the sagging beam. So why are you allowed to do that? You won't be able to. You will not be able to move it afterwards. So Gemara says, no, we're talking about we are going to place it there loosely. It just supports it, but you'll still be able to take it off if you wish, and therefore it's not losing its function. Okay, the next thing was you're allowed to put water. You're allowed to put a kli to catch dripping water. So Gemara answers, this is talking about where the water that's dripping is clean water, and therefore it's not muktzah, you can drink the water, it's not a problem at all. Okay, now the Gemara has a new one that we didn't see before, and that's the following brisa. The brisa says you're allowed to take a basket and put it upside down in front of your bird house. If you have a house where you keep the birds that belong to you, you're raising them, And you need the birds to be able to get in and out of the birdhouse, and you put the basket there so that they can climb up and down on the basket into their house. So why are you allowed to do that? The basket becomes muktzah. Birds, just like all animals, are muktzah. They have no function. There's nothing you can do with them. And therefore, when the bird's on the basket, it's muktzah, and you wouldn't be able to use the basket, so it's losing its function. So Gemara says, no, it's not a problem. Because after the birds are finished, when there's no birds on it, you can pick the thing up. It's not usher, so it doesn't lose its function. It's just temporary that it becomes functionless. Gemara says, but what do you mean? But the Brisa says later that the basket stays functionless. The basket stays muktzah. It's also to move the basket. So the Gemara says, no, that means when the birds are on it, it's forbidden to move the basket because the birds are on it. But once the birds are off, it's okay. The Gemara says, no, but there's a different Brisa that says even when the birds are off, it's still muktzah. So says, no, that's talking about where the birds were on it the entire Benish Mashos. Now, the rule with muktzah always is that whatever the halacha of the kli was at the beginning moment of Shabbos, that sticks for the rest of Shabbos. If it was a muktzah at the beginning of Shabbos, it's muktzah the whole Shabbos, even if the reason that it was a muktzah is later canceled. So here, we're talking about, the Brisa was referring to, where the birds were on the basket the entire Benish Mashos, the entire period during which Shabbos began. So when Shabbos began, there were birds on it, and therefore, even though the birds come off later, it stays muktzah. But we're not talking about that. We are talking about when you put the basket there on Shabbos. The beginning of Shabbos, the basket was not muktzah. It becomes muktzah when the birds are on it, but once the birds are finished, it's not muktzah, and therefore you have not destroyed the function of the kli. It's not bitul kli meichano, and it's not a kasha on Rav Yosef, who says that that's the only problem, according to Rav Chizda, and his ruling about the egg. Okay, now the Gemara goes on to Rav Yitzchak's opinion. Rav Yitzchak says, Rav Chizda is not correct. Rav Chizda said that you're allowed to put the egg, you're allowed to put the cup over the egg to protect it from breaking. Rav Chizda says it's not true. Rav Chizda says you're not allowed to. You're not allowed to do anything for the egg. You're not allowed to catch the egg in a cup. You're not allowed to put the cup over the egg. Rav Chizda clearly holds that there's an isser to move anything for a muktzah sake, for the sake of a muktzah object. Now, Rabbah held that way also, but Rabbah had said that they let you out of that if you were trying to save yourself from a common monetary loss. Rav Yitzchak disagrees. Rav Yitzchak said they didn't allow that for any reason. It's always forbidden. There is no dispensation to allow a person to save himself from any type of loss. It's always forbidden to move a kli for the sake of a muktzah object altogether. Okay, now the Gemara says that they asked Rav Yitzchak all the questions which we asked before. We had asked on Rabbah a whole list of cases which you were permitted to move a kli for the sake of a muktzah object. And in all those cases, Rabbah answered that here the loss is common. But Rav Yitzchak couldn't use those answers because Rav Yitzchak doesn't hold that any loss helps. So the Gemara says Rav Yitzchak answered all of them by saying that the case was where you picked up the kli for a different reason. You picked up the kli because you needed to get it out of the way. For example, the bowl was on your chair. You wanted to sit down on the chair. So you picked it up in a mutter way. Now, once it's in your hand in a mutter way, there's no problem to use it to cover an egg with. Because the only problem is you're not allowed to initially pick up the kli in the first place in order to ultimately use it to take care of or protect a muktzah object. But once the kli is in your hand in a mutter way, you can put it down wherever you want, even over a mutter object. Now the Gemara is going to have a number of new proofs against Rav Yitzchak, and we will usually have the same answer. So the first one is a Mishnah that says that an egg that's laid on Shabbos or on Yom Tov is muktzah. You're not allowed to use it to cover a container. You're not allowed to use it to support the leg of a bed. An egg is very strong. You could even use it to support your bed. But because it's muktzah, it's forbidden to do that. But you are allowed to put a cup over it so that it shouldn't break. So why would Rav Yitzchak allow you to do that? The Gemara answers, not a problem. Again, he picked up the kli for a permitted reason because he needed to move it out of the way of something he needed. Once it's in his hand, then he's allowed to put it over the egg. Okay, next case we have that you're allowed to cover rocks with mats on Shabbos. You might want to cover these rocks because you want to protect them from the rain or from being crumbled, or if they get too wet, you wouldn't be able to use it with cement. So why are you allowed to do that? The rocks are muktzah on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, no, we're talking about non-muktzah rocks. These are rocks that are shaped in an ideal way to use as toilet paper, which is what people used rocks instead of disposables. Okay. Next, the question is, we saw halacha you're allowed to spread mats over bricks on Shabbos to protect them from the rain and things like that. So bricks are definitely muktzah. Why would you be allowed to do that? The Gemara says these are bricks which are left over from construction and they are suitable to lean on. People used to sit beheseba. They used to lean when they ate a meal. The bricks were very useful for that. Okay, the next case will be a lengthy discussion. It says that you're allowed to spread a mat over a beehive to protect the beehive from the sun or from the rain. You just have to be careful not to trap the bees inside. Trapping is an issur, so you don't want to trap the bees. So the actual words are you have to be careful to not intend. You have to be careful not to intend to trap the bees. So over here you clearly see you're allowed to spread a mat to protect the beehive. The beehive is a muktzah thing. So why are you allowed to use the mat to protect it? So Rabbi Yitzchak answers a different answer than before. He says we're talking about where there's honey in the beehive. And if that's the case, then there's food in there. So it's not muktzah because you could get the honey out and you could eat it. So the Gemara asks, hold on a second, but it says whether it's the sun or whether it's the rain. Now, there's only honey in a beehive during the summer. So during the winter, when it rains, there is no honey there. So how could you tell me that there's honey in the hive and that's why you're allowed to spread the mat over? It clearly says, even if you're using it to protect from the rain, which means that it's during the winter. Someone says, okay, so here's the reason. Because even when a hive is inactive, we always leave 2 honeycombs inside full of honey so that the bees should have what to eat. So there's still honey in there. So even when the season is over, there's always going to be honey left inside the hive, and therefore it's not muktzah. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? But you have to leave the honey there for the bees to eat, so it is muktzah. You can't use it. The Gemara says, no, this is a case where the guy just decided he wants to eat that honey. He says, forget about the bees, I'm going to eat the honey myself, and therefore it's not muktzah anymore. So Gemara says, then the end of the Mishnah, which tries to teach us a case where it's forbidden to cover the honey hives, the beehives with mats. And it says that the case where it's forbidden is where you're trapping the bees. So why does it come up with the simple case where it's forbidden? The case is where you didn't plan to eat the honey. So the Gemara answers, that's simple. We're trying to teach you a case that applies to all types of hives, even non-muktzah ones. And we're trying to say, no matter whether the hive is muktzah or not, whatever the story is, even if it's otherwise permitted because it's the summer or because you plan to eat the honey, whatever it is, got to be careful not to trap the bees. If you trap the bees, that is usher anyway. So now the Gemara says, hold on a second. Who is the author of this brisa according to you? We know there's a machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. You're allowed to do a malacha if it's ein miskaven, if you do not intend to do it. Now this can't be Rabbi Shimon because you just tell me a whole story that there's honey in there and you're planning to use the honey, which is why it's not muktzah. But also can't be Rabbi Yehuda because Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't help if you don't intend to trap the bees. If you trap the bees even without intending to, Rabbi Yehuda says it's usher, you violated a malacha. He does not accept the excuse of I did not intend to trap the bees. So it couldn't fit with anybody. So Gemara says, no, I'll tell you that it's Rabbi Yehuda. When it says do not intend to trap the bees, it means don't trap the bees. It means to be careful to cover it in a way that the bees don't get trapped. Now, this was the Gemara's first explanation to answer the question of how could this entire thing make sense, that there's honey in there during the winter. The Gemara has another answer. The Gemara says it's not a problem because we're not talking about the winter. We're talking about in the month of Nisan or the spring, where sometimes it's hot and sometimes it rains. So the Brisa says make sure you don't. The Brisa says you may want to cover the beehive because of the rain or because of the sun. Both could be happening at the same time. And in the month of Nisan, it's bee season, it's honey season. There could definitely be honey in the hive. But you're right, during the winter there's no honey there, it's muktzah, you would not be allowed to cover it with a mat of any sort. Okay, now the Gemara has a raya to Rabbi Yitzchak. The Gemara says that Rav Sheish has told his Talmidim, go tell Rabbi Yitzchak that Rav Huna already paskin like you, and Rav Huna, who was in Bavel, while Rabbi Yitzchak was in Eretz Yisrael, Rav Huna said a halacha which agrees with you, because Rav Huna said that you're allowed to make a covering, an awning, to block the sun over a corpse, a body of the dead. in order to protect it from the sun, which would cause it to decay too fast. You're not allowed to move it on Shabbos, so you can't refrigerate it, but you could protect it from the sun, and you could make this awning, but you have to be careful to do it in a way where it's for the sake of the living and not for the sake of the dead. So here, you clearly see that Rav Huna says that you're not allowed to just build an awning over the dead body, because you're not allowed to do things for the sake of muktzah objects. You have to do it for the sake of the living, and then it works for the dead afterwards. Now, the Gemara says, how does this work? How are you supposed to make this awning for the sake of the living, and you're really trying to help the corpse? So the Gemara says, this is what you do. You have two people come sit next to the corpse, one on each side, on the hot ground, and they feel hot. The ground is hot. So they bring a bed, and they want to sit on the bed. So they're sitting on the bed. And then the sun is beating down on them, so they feel hot on their heads. So they take a mat, and they spread it, they hold it up between them, and they spread it over their heads, so they should be shaded from the sun. So now you have the mat shading the corpse, and you have the bed underneath them. So then what they could do is each one could lift up his bed to hold up the mat instead of him, and walk away. And then you end up with the mat held up by the two the beds that they brought there before. Now, why do you have to do it like this? Why don't you just have them set up the beds with the mat over their heads? Why do they have to first sit on the ground and be hot? The reason is because it's a problem to put a roof on top of two walls is a problem of building an ohel on Shabbos. It's forbidden. You're not allowed to do it that way. You have to first put up the roof and then stick the bed underneath it. That's a not normal way to build something, and therefore it's permitted to build a temporary ohel, temporary shelter in that circumstance. So therefore they had to first have the beds there, and then they have to hold the shade, you have to hold the mat in place, and then they could stick the beds underneath to hold it up, and then once it's up, then they can walk away, because it wasn't built for the corpse, it wasn't built for the dead, it wasn't built for the muktzah object, it was built for them. Okay, now the Gemara goes into the halachos of dealing with moving a dead person on Shabbos so that he doesn't decay. There is a certain amount of heter that we gave for the kavod, for the honor, for the dignity of the mace of the dead. And it's a discussion as follows. If you have a corpse lying in the sun, and he's lying on a bed, you want to move him into the shade. So how could you move him? What is the heter? So Rabbi Yehuda says in the Mishmul, you could roll it over from bed to bed. This is called moving muktzah kilachar yad. You're not moving it directly. You're not moving it. You're moving another object, and it gets moved along the way indirectly. Normally, you would not be allowed to do that on Shabbos if you're intending to move the muktzah object. But here, for the sake of the dead, we let you do it that way. Now Rav Chanina bar Shlomiah said there's a different way to do it. You put a loaf of bread, or you put a child, or any other significantly valuable non-muktzah object on it, and then you can move it. Again, you wouldn't be allowed to do that for other things, but for the sake of the dignity of the dead, we allowed you to do that. Now, the Gemara says that they both agree that the strategy of the bread and the child is the best one. The question is, if there's no bread, a child, or other non-muktzah object available, are you allowed to roll him from the bed to bed? That's a machlokes. That's what they argue about. You're allowed to do that or not. So now the Gemara says that this seems to be a machlokes between two Tanaim, because we have a machlokes about if you have the dead corpse and there's a fire, and you want to save the body from the fire. So Yehuda ben Lakish says you're allowed to move it. But the Tanai Chama says you're not allowed to move it. So now the Gemara says, what's the case over here? What is this machlokes about whether or not you're allowed to move to save the body from the fire? If we're talking about with bread or child to place on it and move it, so everybody agrees you're allowed to do that. Why should it be usur? If you're talking about where there is nothing, there's no bread, there's no infant, there's no child, there's no permitted way of moving it, then what would be the tzad? What would be the explanation of Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish, who says that you are allowed to move it? Must be that they're arguing about where you can move it kalachayah. You can move it indirectly by rolling it somehow. And the question is, just like we said before, that a machlokes amiram, are you allowed to? This is the same machlokes over there. Are you allowed to do that or not? So the Gemara explains, no, that's not what this machlokes is about. It's about something else. The question over here is that a person would be very upset if there's a fire approaching the body of his relative. That may cause him to put the fire out. So Yehuda ben Lakish says, because in order to save him from doing the Isser of putting the fire out, we let you move it even though it's Muktzah, in order to prevent him from doing a bigger Isser. Okay, now the Gemara says that the halacha actually is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish, you're allowed to move it to save it from the fire. Okay, now let's just go back to the Mishnah for a second. We had said that you aren't allowed to use the oil which drips into a kli. If you have a kli that's catching dripping oil from a fire, the oil is muktzah. You're not allowed to move the oil. You're not allowed to use the oil. Where it says, what about after the fire goes out? Are you allowed to use the oil then? So the Gemara says it's a machlokes between the Tanakama and Rosh Shimon. Tanakama says it's aser. Presumably that's Rabbi Yehuda, and Rosh Shimon says it's mutter. This is a reflection of the common machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rosh Shimon, which we will see going forward in the blot which follow.